Okay, so I'm going to introduce myself first. I'm Claire Kelly, and I'm a mindfulness teacher, and also I work with a UK charity called Mindfulness in Schools Project. But more importantly, I'm delighted to introduce Shannon Harvey, the award-winning director of two internationally acclaimed documentaries, The Connection, Mind Your Body, and My Year of Living Mindfully, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And with us also is Willem Kuyken, who is the director of the Oxford University Mindfulness Centre and also Rit Blatt Professor of Mindfulness and Psychological Science at the University of Oxford. I should say that Shannon's main area of expertise is her work as a health journalist, and she has a book, The Whole Health Life, about finding good health after being diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. As a journalist and filmmaker, she spent many years working for leading news organisations such as the ABC and Fairfax. She's the recipient of the National Press Club of Australia's Health Journalist of the Year award, and now produces a popular blog, which she does whilst trying to balance her health and being the mother of two adventurous boys, apparently. Willem, meanwhile, his main work is focusing on depression and evidence-based approaches to depression, and in particular, examining how mindfulness and mindfulness-based programs can prevent depression and enhance human potential across the lifespan. Does that more or less sum it up? Great. So it would be lovely just to have a general conversation following your amazing film, Shannon. And I guess, first of all, just to congratulate you. I just think it's a very timely piece of documentary making, and one that's just so steeped in the importance of research-based evidence. And I suppose that's the first question I'd like to ask is really, why do you think research around mental and physical health and well-being is so important at the moment?
Yeah, it's funny. I started this whole project because I was really wanting to make a film about mental health. And I am the kind of journalist who likes to provide people with takeaway answers that they can reliably trust. And I was really looking for a solution, something that we could all do every day to protect and nurture and nourish our minds. And I was absolutely stunned when I learned that there is actually nothing. And that's obviously how I landed on mindfulness, because it is pretty much the only thing that ticks all of my boxes, in the sense that it's got a ever-growing evidence base. It's something that people can practice at home on their own. They don't need a university or any kind of medical degree to practice it. And most importantly, and I think Willem can probably talk about this, but most importantly, people don't need to be in a state of crisis in order to start practicing mindfulness. I think a lot of the mental health options that are available are only for people who are deeply, deeply suffering. Do you want to elaborate on that perhaps, Willem?
Yeah, and I think this is something that's been in the contemplative traditions for thousands of years. This idea of the mind is something that anybody can train, and that training can support people to live a better life and to flourish, not just prevent mental health problems, but actually to live well and to live healthily. The analogy that I find quite helpful is with heart disease. If you think about what we know now that we didn't know 50 years ago about heart disease and diet and exercise, I think the same will be true with mental health and mindfulness in the next 50 years. The sorts of things that we can do to take care of our minds and our mental health. Actually, a lot of it isn't rocket science. It's quite simple ideas. But if it can be mainstreamed, and I think this film is a really important part of the mainstreaming of that. If it can be mainstreamed, I think we can see a really profound influence on mental health in the whole population.
Thank you. It's interesting hearing you talk about people being in crisis before they decide to start exploring mindfulness, and I wonder how it might be possible to shift that slightly. I mean, obviously there's benefit if you are struggling, and your film describes that beautifully. But how do we persuade people to have a go, even if they don't feel that they're in crisis? Very often you hear people saying, I don't need it because I'm fine. What can we do, or should we do anything about that?
I'm handing that one straight to Willem, actually.
I think that's very true, Claire, that often people will come to mindfulness or all sorts of psychological approaches because they are in a place where they need some help. They're suffering, they're in pain, they are recovering from a health condition. And that's great. That makes sense. That's one place to start. I guess for me, another place to start is to think of, maybe to use slightly poetic language, to think of it more like a love affair. People don't fall in love because they're suffering. They fall in love because there's a joy with falling in love, and people have friendships and lovers because that's something that enriches their lives. And I've come to see mindfulness practice a little bit like that, a bit like a friendship or a love affair. It's something that enriches my life. It helps me through difficulties. It's something that also accentuates all the good things in my life. And that doesn't feel then like an obligation. It feels like something that I want to do. So I come to my mindfulness practice every morning, not because it's an obligation, it's because it's something I want to do, and I know it will enrich the rest of my life.
It's interesting, actually. It makes me remember the moment in the film, Shannon, where you make it really clear that you're finding it really horrible, that you're having a very difficult time with your practice. So what advice would you have? Because I think that's a very common experience to begin with. What advice would you have for people who maybe are hitting that point in their practice?
Yeah, I there's two things that I'd say to that. I have tried many times, even before my year of living mindfully, to establish a regular practice, simply because I felt that it was something I should do. With my previous film, The Connection, I'd met Herbert Benson, who is a renowned scientist from Harvard who discovered the relaxation response, and he told me all about this incredible thing called the relaxation response and how healthy that would be for my immune system. And I also at that time met Jon Kabat-Zinn, who told me all about MBSR and how, there was some of that initial research that he did in the 80s about psoriasis healing. I think it was 4 times faster when people meditated. There was enough evidence for me to know that meditation was something I should do. But there's a really big difference between knowing and actually doing and actually putting it into practice. And I think, truthfully, part of me was curious about this mental health epidemic and answering the big questions there, but I also wanted to know whether mindfulness was actually worth it. Is it really? How often would we rather, you two are both very long-term meditators, I know, but for beginners, it's much, much easier to sit down and watch television after a hard day of work than it is to sit and be with uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. And so I wanted to know once and for all if it was going to be worth it. And I think that's partly why the experiment became so enormously elaborate. Because if I didn't meditate, then there was going to be nothing interesting for the scientists to measure. So they were kind of holding me to account.
So can I just come back in to something that Shannon said, and then I want to ask Claire a question, which is, it is true, of course, that who would choose to sit with uncomfortable thoughts and feelings rather than watch something on Netflix that is really enjoyable, right? Who would choose to do that? But the reverse is also true, right? You're actually with somebody that you love and you care about, or you're eating a beautiful meal. Isn't it a travesty that you're actually not tasting that meal, or you're not actually present with that person? And that's the reverse side of it, that actually mindfulness isn't about sitting with uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. That's just one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is actually to taste that meal and to be present with that person that you're with. So one of the questions I then have for Claire, and sorry to be breaking the rules when the interviewee asks the interviewer a question.
I'm the one who asked.
But you, and you're a school teacher. I love it. So battle, I can see. But of course, one of the answers to this question is children and young people, and that's where you work. And how does one begin to? And one could argue that young children are naturally mindful. But how could you begin to bring mindfulness practice into the everyday lives of children? I think that's another way of looking at this, so that actually it's commonplace. It's not something that you learn when you're an adult and you suffer from depression or some physical health problem, but actually as a child, it's something that you learn in the same way that you learn to brush your teeth or to tie your shoelaces.
Well, funnily enough, that's what we do. I think with the younger ones in particular, you've got to make it fun. You've got to make it fun, and you've got to make it apply to real life. And also, actually, with teenagers, you have to make it really clear what the potential benefits might be, because they're not going to invest time and energy in anything that's not got research evidence behind it, which goes back to exactly what you were doing in your film, Shannon. Yeah, that would be my film. Anyway, moving on. Thank you. Okay, a broader question here, really, that obviously there's been a huge explosion in the popularity of mindfulness. And I did a Google search a couple of months back, and it came up with something like 90 million search findings. So it's out there. And with that comes confusion, I think, about what mindfulness is and what it isn't. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to define it. But how do we work with that? So, for example, if you're someone who's interested in doing some mindfulness, then how do you begin to find out where you should do it and with whom? How can you find your way through all that stuff that's online? Any ideas?
Well, I can talk about how I started, but I'd love to know what the expert teachers say on that, and whether or not I was kind of following the recommended curriculum. But I started with an app, and then once that app wasn't serving me, I moved to a different app. But it became very, very clear within months, a matter of months of practicing for 20 minutes a day, that I needed a teacher, because apps, I think, can be good, when you want to get started, but you really, there's nothing quite like that, the expertise of somebody who can kind of almost like tune into my own specific, unique struggles and teach and meet those needs. And really, once I started learning with a teacher, I did mindfulness-based stress reduction, the 8-week course, and my teacher was Timothy Goddard. And it was like, whoa, it was just like a whole turbocharge of practice that also coincided, though, interestingly, going from 20 minutes a day to 45 minutes a day, which, I'm sure it was multiple factors as to why things really changed for me then. But I think that the role of a real teacher is so, so important.
Willem, any thoughts in addition to that?
I'd agree with that, and I'd say I think learning mindfulness is a lifelong journey. And I think at the beginning of the journey, you need to introduce mindfulness in a way that is accessible, palatable, interesting, useful. And probably between Insight Timer, Headspace, and Calm, they have probably introduced mindfulness to more people than any other vehicle in the world, both in the modern world and the ancient world. But I think after that, you need to then take people on an onward journey. And I think that's the place of kind of reputable mindfulness centers, research centers, but also Buddhist centers and other kind of contemplative centers, where people can, with the guidance of a really skilled teacher, go deeper and go deeper, if that's what they choose to do. And I think that's a kind of a lifelong journey. And in some cases, people take that quite deep. They'll go on retreats for a couple of days or a week or a month, possibly even longer than that. So I think this is an exploration that can start in quite a light way and still be really useful, but it can go deeper and deeper and deeper for different people. I think the final thing I'd say about this, which I think is really important, is that it kind of depends on what you're hoping to learn from mindfulness. And I think what we're seeing happening in the mindfulness field is that the work that we've done is really here in Oxford and in Toronto with Zindel Siegel and Cambridge with John Teasdale, is about people with depression and helping them to stay well in the long term. And the work that Jon Kabat-Zinn's done has been with chronic pain, and the work that others have done have been with addiction. So there's also a clarity of intention, and one of the things I think is beautiful about mindfulness is that it can actually be it can be formulated so it can be particularly useful for different groups of people. And that requires really skillful teachers to guide those people in learning mindfulness so that they can step free from addiction, they can learn to live without depression, they can learn to live with chronic pain.
Thank you. Just noticing that you mentioned the B word, Buddhism, and we get asked a lot about, is doing mindfulness Buddhism by the back door? Are we trying to sneak in a little bit of Buddhism without people noticing? I just wonder what you both thought about that in terms of your own experience. Shannon, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I get asked about this from the opposite side because the film very, very lightly touches on Buddhism. And so people who are particularly Buddhist say, you've taken the Buddhism out of mindfulness. Why did you do that? And my answer is just simply because that's where I started. I'm a health journalist. And I was following a story about evidence and science. And that's the journey that I followed to its never end. So it turned out. But I think that there is, I'm writing a book which accompanies the film. Actually, I've finished the book. As of today, I delivered it to the publisher. So the book is finished, but I actually decided to dedicate a significant portion of the book to this subject matter because, I think when you really look at it, when you just go back and you kind of look at where this all began, it kind of began with the world's first psychologist. This guy thousands and thousands of years ago who sat down and studied his mind in this really meticulous way and then developed a systematic set of teachings for other people to then sit down and examine their own minds. And so, so I think it might have been Willem who said to me, did you know that the Buddha was not a Buddhist? And I think that's, if you kind of take that as the starting point, then I think that makes the conversation a bit more, perhaps popular is not quite the right word that I want to find, but secular might be the better word for it.
Willem, how about you?
I'm a real pragmatist. For me, it's about, can we find the very best description of how the mind can create joy and how it creates suffering, and can we find the very best practices to support people to live their lives well? Now, the Buddha had some interesting things to say about that. He got quite a lot of things, I think, right, which have been borne out by contemporary science. He also got some things wrong. But there are other contemplative traditions too that use meditative practices, that use prayer, that are ways of stabilizing the mind, steadying the mind, cultivating compassion, cultivating joy. So I'm a real pragmatist. What's the very best map that is evidence-based? What's the very best route map and ways of getting along that route? And let's use those, let's research those, let's disseminate those, and let's make them so that people can use them. So Claire, to use your language, let's make them so that primary school kids find them fun and find them useful. Let's make them so that skeptical teenagers go, yeah, that's going to help me with my exams. That's going to help me not spend all night up on social media the day before I've got an exam. So I think I'm just a pragmatist about this, I guess.
Great, thank you. So given that it's also brilliant and marvellous and wonderful, or not, I wonder whether it's worth just quickly mentioning, this tendency for people to get a slightly evangelical about mindfulness once they start to see the benefits, and what the potential issues might be with that approach. Is mindfulness for everybody? And if so, should everybody be doing it? Should it be mainstream? Big question, I'm sorry, all in one go. Do you want to start, Shannon? Or do you want to start, Willem?
I'd like Willem to start, then I can piggyback off his wise words.
So, for me, two answers to that. Is mindfulness for everyone? Yes, in a sense, because everybody has got a mind that can pay attention, has got the capacity to bring compassion and wisdom to their everyday life. They don't have to practice mindfulness. They don't even need to know what the idea is. It's an innate human capacity. So in that sense, yes, it's for everyone. Are mindfulness practices as they're taught in mindfulness-based programs for everyone? Of course they're not. For some people, there are easier and different ways to get to where they're trying to get to, and the research there bears that out. So I've done trials looking at mindfulness-based cognitive therapy compared with antidepressants. For some people, the antidepressants are the way to go. For other people, the MBCT is the way to go. So of course it's not for everyone. I think evangelism is a real turn-off, and I think that is indeed one of the risks for the field, is for people to overstate the evidence, to be overly enthusiastic. I think humility and being very aware of what all the unanswered questions are is the way in which we can build from where we are just now. I just finished by saying, of course, we're not starting from a standstill of Jon Kabat-Zinn's work. We're starting from a standstill of 2,500 years of work, where some of these ideas have honed and developed and evolved into India and into China and into other Asian countries and into the West. So this isn't just, a 20, 30 year, 40 year development. This is a much longer development than that. So I think we have to have the long view here. Shannon, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I struggled with this question during the filming because of the exceptional work, actually, that's been done by Richie Davidson and his group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where they developed the HEP, the Health Enhancement Program, as a direct comparison to MBSR. And I think there's now been 3 or 4 clinical trials that have run where they've run the two groups parallel to one another and compared the outcomes. And it's so interesting that if you dive into some of the papers that they've published, one in particular, and you read people's comments about the program, and you read the comments as though you didn't know which program they had done. And you read the comments and it's like, this is the best thing I've ever done in my life. And this is life-changing, and this praise. And you look at, then you marry those comments and you see that they did the health enhancement program, not the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. And what I took away from that research is that quite often, anything we do intentionally to look after our health is going to be good. It's just quite often we're just neglecting our health to a very high degree. So there's that component that I want to say. But the other thing I want to say is that I do think that it is that our mind culturally is something that is entirely neglected. And there is this glaring gap that I know that current evidence tells me that I should be exercising for at least 30 minutes a day, physically getting my heart rate going in some way, and perhaps putting in some muscle training as well. Not sitting, too often, making sure I stand up enough. I should be eating my 5 fruit and vegetables. I should be sleeping. I've done my own data and I need to be sleeping for 9 hours a night. We have all of these recommendations about all these very tangible things to do with our health, and yet there is no recommendation about tending to our mind. And so I think that this is a huge gap in the research literature. I think perhaps it's because, the mind has been this really mysterious thing, or perhaps until now it's been left to the sages and the religious leaders to tend to. And I think that's where people like Willem are so important, because I think that they're bringing the mind into this kind of scientific realm in a very credible way.
So maybe stepping back a little bit now and just kind of looking at the broader issues facing the world at the moment. Obviously, we're in the middle of the the COVID-19 lockdown period. The world is changing before our very eyes. And I wondered whether either of you have a sense of the ways in which mindfulness might, A, support people during and coming out of this period of lockdown. And secondly, assuming that the world is slightly different when we re-enter it, what opportunities might there be from a mindfulness perspective to bring something else to how we're living in this brave new world? So I guess the question, I'll break it down a little bit, but how might mindfulness support people during and coming out of COVID-19 lockdown? And then is there a broader ethical, environmental, spiritual way in which mindfulness might enrich this new world we're entering? These are big questions. I'm sorry, I can give you a minute to think.
Shannon, do you want to kick off?
Okay. When I was just recently putting the epilogue onto the book that I've just put the full stop on, I was writing about this COVID world that we live in now, and how we were already tracking in all the wrong directions in terms of mental health before this happened. And I suspect that once the epidemiologists and those kind of health experts start falling away in terms of being the most important voice at the moment, and we start hearing the voice of health economists, and we start hearing the voice of social science researchers, I don't think that this pandemic is going to be measured by the number of jobs lost, or by the number of lives tragically lost, or even by the number of frontline health workers who emerge with post-traumatic stress. I don't think those will be the only figures that we measure this situation by. I think we'll also be measuring it by the increased rates of suicide, the number of children who emerge from lockdown with technology addictions. I think that the mental health costs of this are going to be enormous, and I really, really hope that this is an opportunity for funding to be injected, and the research needs to come online so that we can actually face this together. I also, perhaps naively, but I also hope that this is actually going to lead to some international cooperation on some of these big issues, because whilst ever we try to tackle these big global problems sort of state by state or county by county or even country by country, I don't think we're actually ever going to get there. And so hopefully there'll be some fertile ground for collaboration. Maybe that sounded hopelessly naive.
Not at all. How about you, Willem?
So there was a Royal Society UK Gov poll carried out here recently, where only 9% of respondents said that they wanted to go back to the life that they had before COVID-19. I think that's extraordinary, and I think for me that signals a sort of quite an optimistic sense of, is this actually individually, but also at a larger societal level, does it have the seeds of being a massive wake-up call? A massive wake-up call. And what do I mean by that? I think all of the problems that I think you're speaking to, Claire, most people would agree they are to do with division, conflict, lack of equality and access to education and healthcare, climate change. All of these problems are going to find their solution in the human mind and the human heart. And what psychologists and mindfulness teachers are and social scientists are saying is that we have quite a lot to say about how to train the human mind and the human heart. And a trained human mind and a human heart in an environment of everybody waking up could be a tremendous force for good. These changes are going to come, as Shannon just said, in massive cooperation. We saw that after the Second World War. There's been an erosion of that, a massive erosion of that in the last few years. But they're also going to come from very individual actions. The kindness of a parent to their child, the care for an elderly neighbour, the choice to purchase something when you know that actually you don't need to purchase that, but it's actually going to have an effect on climate change. I am quite hopeful, but I also see psychologists, social scientists, mindfulness teachers having a really big role to play. They need to step up and support that kind of change, because it is a very ripe moment right now. It's a very ripe moment for change right now. And wouldn't it be amazing if 100 years from now people look back on this period of history and say, gosh, that was a time where the world turned a corner? And if you think back to something like the London Plague, that was not the case. With the London Plague, what happened was the royal family left London and left to safety. The people who lived in poverty died. The people that the population thought were to blame for the London Plague were killed in the streets. It was horrendous what happened there. And I think we have the potential now for something really quite different to happen. But I'm an optimist, and I too can be naive sometimes. But I prefer to be an optimist and naive sometimes than just be proven wrong.
I'm also very mindful of the fact that here in the UK, 8-week mindfulness courses and ongoing support sessions are offered to MPs and peers and their support staff, and lots of, I think even hundreds of them have now done it. And I think the same might be happening in Australia. Is that right?
Not that I know of. I hope so, but I've not heard of it.
Okay. So here's the question then. If all parliaments around the world started to have mindfulness as an option, maybe once a day they all got to practice together, what effect might that have, if any?
Well, I know the effect, it's a sort of limited effect I know it's had in the UK Parliament, is that there are a group of peers and parliamentarians who've been practicing together for years now, across party lines. And I think, I know there's a great deal of collaboration and mutual understanding and support within that group of people. And there is a sense amongst that group of people that this is the basis for a kind of a more thoughtful, compassionate dialogue around issues that really matter. So I guess that's the potential. And of course, this whole idea of a trained mind and a trained heart is the kind of the quote that's sometimes used is sort of between stimulus and reaction, there is a space, and in that space is our potential to respond with greater wisdom, with greater skillfulness. And of course, that's what people in positions of authority are having to do all the time. They're having to make decisions. Often a lot of decisions in the course of a day. If they could have a bit more spaciousness, a bit more support and resourcing to do that, it seems to me likely that we would have a more thoughtful, compassionate dialogue at a kind of political level.
So, Willem, I know that in response to this lockdown period and then potentially moving forward, there's a whole range of online resources now and training opportunities that the Oxford Mindfulness Centre is offering. Do you mind saying a little bit about that?
Yes, so on our website, we are offering a whole set of resources for people who want to learn mindfulness, for the general population who want to learn mindfulness, and then another set of resources for people who want to teach mindfulness to others. That includes practices, it includes podcasts, it includes various blogs, links to books and other resources. And it's all in the service of providing high quality materials for two groups of people, those who want to learn mindfulness and those who want to teach mindfulness.
So I just want to say a huge thank you, Shannon, first of all, just for being here and talking to us, and for this great gift of a film that you've brought together. and also for the fact that you're just so rigorous in how you question things, and even the research that you undertook yourself as part of the film, and your honesty about your own experiences of mindfulness. I just think it's such a great opportunity for people to really get to grips with what this is all about, warts and all. And also to you, Willem, thank you for all your wisdom that you've brought to this conversation as well, and the experience you've had of being there on the front line, training people and teaching people about this thing they call mindfulness. So thank you both ever so much. It's been really great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.